Every night, without fail, my dad would sit in his armchair, a full bowl of popcorn in his hand, watching with amusement as my stepmother tormented me. Even if I fell flat on my face, he would just grin. But on their wedding anniversary, I made up my mind to prepare an unforgettable dinner for them. That night, it was their turn to be the performers. I was born in Sweetwater in 1953 in a mud house with hardened cement floors. That area is now the El Laredo neighborhood, but back then it was mostly woods and scattered houses, nothing like the bustling place it is today. My father's name is Garcino Santos. He's a tall, thin man who makes a living by growing tobacco. Tobacco has always been a local specialty. He gets up at the first crow of the rooster every day and doesn't return home until the sun has set behind the mountains, dragging his tired body along. May God bless my mother's spirit in heaven. Her name was Isabel dos Anjos Santos. She was small in stature, but full of energy. Her brown eyes curved into crescent moons when she smiled, sparkling brightly. She had long, jet-black hair, which she always wore in a low bun, and slender hands that could conjure up all sorts of delicious dishes in the kitchen. I can still smell the aroma of her deta farofa, a traditional Brazilian dish, when I close my eyes, mixed with the lavender scent she sprayed after ironing clothes over charcoal. It's so comforting. There are only 3 people in my family. My mother had a very difficult time giving birth, which I only realized after I grew up. I am God's only child, so she poured all her love into me and doted on me terribly. I remember even when I was 8 or 9 years old, she would still comb my hair every morning, humming a lullaby as she did so. She always called me my little princess. You're the little son in my family. Our house was simple, but it was our real home. There were 3 rooms, a living room, which was also my parents' bedroom, my small bedroom. The window faced the backyard, offering a view of lots of greenery, and the heart of the house, the kitchen. My mother cooked on a wood-fired stove, where there was always a pot of beans and a pot of white rice simmering. If we were lucky, we might even have fried fish or free-range chickens from the yard. In the backyard, there was a guava tree that bore sweet fruit all year round. There was also a mango tree, which I always loved to climb to pick the ripe mangoes, and we also raised some laying hens, which provided us with fresh eggs. My father also grew some okra and mascara, a type of pumpkin, and my mother always managed to make unique and delicious dishes with these ingredients. My childhood games were so simple, just like any other country girls in the 1960s. Making corn dolls, playing house under the mango tree, running barefoot in the yard. My neighbor was a girl named Adenelda. We'd always spend our afternoons together making up stories, playing school games, and pretending to cook in the clay pot her mother made. I remember my mother teaching me to do housework from a young age. Girls must learn to rely on themselves, she would say as she taught me how to season beans. She also taught me crochet, and the tablecloth I use now is one I crocheted using that skill. She taught me how to cut vegetables into even pieces and how to light a wood-burning stove without burning myself. My father was a man of few words, but he had his own way of showing affection. Every day, he would come back from the tobacco fields, covered in red mud, take a bath in the backyard, and then sit in the straw chair in the living room listening to the day's news. Every Saturday afternoon, he would take me to Mr. Aristide's little shop to buy my favorite coconut candy. Occasionally, he would also bring me a rag doll that the women sold at the market, which would make me happy for days. But in 1963, when I turned 10, all the peace was shattered. My mother started to fall ill. At first, she would just complain of headaches in the mornings, but then she gradually became thinner and thinner, her face pale, and she was always listless. My father took her to see the doctor in town and later to Mashio, but medical conditions back then were nothing like they are now, children. For poor families like ours, the options available were pitifully few. For those few months, I took care of my mother, helped with housework, and tried to make ends meet. My mother spent most of her time in bed, and I would bring her chicken soup and lemon balm tea, something our neighbor, Mrs. Kitalia, taught me to make. "Don't be sad, my darling," my mother would say weakly, holding my thin hand. "Mommy will get better soon." But God had other plans. One morning in December 1963, I woke up and called to her, but she never responded. She had passed away peacefully the night I slept in the next room. It was the first time I had ever seen my father cry, that kind of silent weeping that country folk don't easily show, and it pierced my heart. The funeral was simple. Neighbors came to help, bringing food, flowers from their gardens, and words of comfort. When my father went with the funeral procession to the municipal cemetery, Donna Kitalia stayed with me. I will always remember the emptiness in the house, the absence of my mother humming in the kitchen, and even the smells in the air felt unfamiliar. For the next few months, my dad and I tried to live on our own. He worked even harder, probably trying to forget the pain by keeping busy, while I did my best to take care of the family. By the age of 10, I had already learned to cook beans, wash clothes in the sink, and clean the house and yard. Our neighbors would also lend a hand whenever they could. During this period of mourning and adjustment, my father began visiting Mrs. Krilda's house. She was a widow who lived on the other side of town. She was about 40 years old, quite large, with a loud voice and a very strong personality. They met at my mother's 7-day Massachusetts. After that, she often appeared at our house, either to bring us some food or to check on us. At first, I thought it was nice to have a woman in the house. It added a touch of warmth and life. Mrs. Krilda would bring corn cakes and coconut candies, and she would tell me things that her father wouldn't understand about a daughter's feelings. But after a few months, I slowly noticed that the way she looked at me was strange, as if she was weighing something, calculating something, which made me uneasy. My father and Mrs. Krilda's wedding took place in June 1964, just 6 months after my mother's death. It was a simple registration ceremony, no party, no joyful atmosphere whatsoever. I was 11 years old, standing there in my only pretty blue dress, knowing in my heart that something very important in my life was about to change forever. After the ceremony, we returned home. Mrs. Krilda, now my stepmother, looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Helen, now we're a real family. In a family, everyone has to do their part." At the time, I didn't quite understand what she meant, but it wasn't long before I understood completely. For the first few days, she was quite kind to me. She helped me tidy my room, did my laundry, and even braided my hair. My father breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he had made the right decision. He kept telling me, "Look, daughter, Krilda will take good care of you. You have a mother again." Poor father, he had no idea what was going to happen next. But the first week had barely ended when the truth came out. I remember it was a Friday evening. My father came home from work, showered, ate dinner, and sat in the straw chair in the living room as usual. Krilda came out of the kitchen with a large bowl of freshly made popcorn. She said to my father, "Gino, now that we're family, we need to set some rules. Helen needs to learn to listen and respect the current situation." She placed the bowl of popcorn on my father's lap and continued, "And you, as the man of the house, need to support me, otherwise this little brat will run wild." Dad simply nodded, already popping a piece of popcorn into his mouth. He was always averse to trouble and preferred to avoid conflict. "Whatever you say, Krilda, you know better than I do how to raise a girl." That very night, everything began. Krilda called me into the living room and stood before me with her hands on her hips. "Helen, you need to understand, things are different now. I'm not the mother who spoiled you anymore. Rules apply here." She started listing a bunch of harsh rules for me. I had to get up before sunrise, sweep the yard, wash the dishes from the night before, and make breakfast for the two of them. During the day, besides going to school, I also had to feed the chickens, mow the lawn, and wash clothes in the sink. After dinner, I had to wash all the dishes, clean the kitchen and living room, and only then could I go to bed. She pointed at my face and said, "If I find out you're slacking off, you'll be in big trouble." I looked at my dad, hoping he would say something fair, but he just kept eating his popcorn, staring at a small puddle on the ground, as if he hadn't seen anything. At first, I tried to do everything perfectly, thinking that things would get better if I behaved. I got up in the dead of night, lit the wood-burning stove, and swept the yard before the neighbors woke up. At school, I was always tired and sleepy, but I still tried my best to keep up with the lessons. But no matter what I did, Krilda was never satisfied. The popcorn was either too salty or too bland. The rice was either too soft or too hard. The yard wasn't swept properly, and the clothes weren't washed thoroughly. There was always something to criticize, always a reason to yell at me. She throws a tantrum. Dad sits in his chair eating popcorn, the sound of him chewing mingling with her cursing at me, creating a particularly jarring noise. She also uses all sorts of harsh and hurtful words to insult me. The first time she hit me was in August of that year. I accidentally broke a glass in the kitchen, and it slipped from my wet hands. She rushed in from the living room, and without even asking what happened, slapped me hard across the face, making my vision blur. "You clumsy, useless girl. This glass was left by my mother. You never care about anything." I fell to the ground, my cheek burning with pain, and tears welled up instantly. Just then, I saw Dad standing in the living room doorway, holding a bowl of popcorn. For a moment, I thought he would come over to protect me, like Mom used to, but he just stood there, reached into the bowl, picked up a piece of popcorn, put it in his mouth, crunched it, and then turned and walked back to his chair. This was just the beginning of countless horrific nights. Krilda discovered that no matter what she did to me, my father wouldn't interfere. She would hit me at the slightest provocation, and my father would sit in his chair, eating popcorn and enjoying it all. He wasn't blind to my injuries, my tears. He wasn't blind to my screams, my cries. But he just sat there, chewing on that popcorn that would haunt my nightmares later. One September evening, Krilda beat me again because the beans were sticking to the bottom of the pot. I hid behind the living room door, watching them both. She laughed and told Dad how she was punishing me. "Look how stubborn this girl is, Gino, but don't worry, I'll discipline her properly, and she'll listen to me sooner or later." Dad, with that damned bowl of popcorn on his lap, just nodded and continued eating, the crunch-crunch sound particularly clear in the quiet room. That very night, I realized a terrible truth. To my father, my suffering was like a radio program, his entertainment after a hard day's work. My misery wasn't a tragedy, but rather his evening pastime. Months passed, and things got worse. Krilda would even wake me up in the middle of the night to do chores she'd come up with on the spur of the moment. "Get up, you lazybones. Go clean the bathroom, it stinks." I'd be left scrubbing the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, still in my pajamas and barefoot, while the sound of him eating popcorn could be clearly heard from the living room. She gave me less and less food, saying I was getting fat and no one would want to marry me. For me, even a proper dinner became a luxury. Most nights, I could only sneak a little something to eat while cooking. If I couldn't help but cry, Krilda would make me stand in the middle of the living room, in front of them, until I stopped crying. "Crying won't solve anything. Stop acting here." And Dad would just sit there, munching on popcorn, watching me as if I were an animal on display in a zoo. One December evening, almost a year into their marriage, Krilda fabricated a story that I had stolen her money. It wasn't true at all. I didn't even know where she hid it. But she screamed that I was a thief, just like my mother. "Your mother was a shameless woman too. That's why she died young, heartbroken, because she had a daughter like you." The moment she mentioned my mother, something inside me suddenly exploded. I glared at her angrily and said, "Don't you dare talk about my mother like that. You don't even know her." This was the first time I'd ever talked back to her, and the first time she'd ever really hit me hard. She punched me, pulled my hair, and pushed me to the ground. I screamed, begging my dad to come and save me. Do you know what he did? Did he tell Krilda to stop? Did he run over to help me? No. He got up from his chair, went to the kitchen, refilled the popcorn bowl, then went back to the living room and sat down to see more clearly. That night, I lay in bed covered in wounds and finally understood I no longer had a father. The only person beside me was a man who lived in the same house. He treated my pain as entertainment, my tears as snacks, swallowing them down with that damned popcorn. It was on that very night that I lay in bed, unable to sleep because of the pain all over my body, when a thought I'd never had before popped into my head for the first time. Since they enjoy watching it so much, since my pain makes them so happy, maybe one day I can put on a different show for them. 1965 arrived, and for me, it was a year devoid of hope. At 12 years old, I already knew that waking up each day meant facing new torment. Krilda knew she could do whatever she wanted to me, and my father was the most faithful audience to her cruelty. Those so-called discipline lessons, that's what she liked to call them, became an unshakable routine at home. Every evening after dinner, as soon as Dad sat in his straw chair with a bowl of popcorn on his lap, I knew my ordeal was about to begin. It was like a scheduled program. "Helen, come here, I have something to tell you." She would call to me in that tone I could recognize from a distance. I had no choice but to obediently go over because I had nowhere else to run. Dad was already prepared, his bowl full of fresh popcorn, legs crossed, waiting for the performance to begin. Krilda had a devilish creativity. She could always come up with new reasons to punish me. If the food was good, she said I hadn't tried my best. If it wasn't good, she said I was useless. If I cried, she said I was weak. If I didn't cry, she said I was shameless. She'd pull my hair while yelling, "You're just like your mother, useless, only a burden to others." These words were more hurtful than any slap or pinch. And Dad made those nauseating chewing sounds that echoed in the room. One February evening, she fabricated a lie that I had deliberately broken a glass. The glass hadn't actually broken. She had broken it herself in front of me and then insisted it was my fault. "Now, you'll pay for your lie and your clumsiness," she said, making me kneel on the living room floor, right in front of my father, and then starting to hit my head. My father, munching on popcorn, seemed to be following the rhythm of each slap. He didn't look away for a second, watching intently, as if listening to a captivating radio drama. Even when Krilda came up with new ways to humiliate me, a slight smile would appear on his lips. The violence escalated. She started hitting me with a wooden spoon, pinching me until bruises appeared, and pulling my hair until I screamed. She also discovered that Dad not only allowed her to do this, but even seemed to enjoy it. "Gino, look at this stubborn girl you've raised," she said as she tormented me. Dad would reply, "You decide, Krilda, you know what's going on," and then continue eating his damn popcorn as if watching a movie. In March, she devised a new way to torture me. She would make me stand in front of them and recount, one by one, the things I supposedly did wrong during the day. Today, Helen took 5 minutes longer to wash the dishes than usual. Yesterday, she dropped a bean on the ground. The day before yesterday, I asked her to sweep the yard again, and she sighed. I stood there trembling, and she treated every little thing I did as a sin. My father would nod repeatedly, as if I were truly the worst person in the world. Snap, snap, that sound even haunted my dreams. But what broke my heart the most wasn't the physical pain, but seeing how much my father enjoyed it all. I noticed that every time Krilda finished hitting me, my father would be in a particularly good mood. He would tell her jokes, even laugh out loud, as if my pain was the best cure for his boredom. One April night, when I was almost 13, something happened that I'll never forget. Krilda said I looked at her strangely, but I didn't. She beat me really badly. I fell to the ground and couldn't get up for a long time. I lay on the cold living room floor, my whole body aching as if it were falling apart. Do you know what Daddy did? He got up from his chair, went to the kitchen to refill the popcorn bowl, and came back. But instead of sitting back in his chair, he sat on the floor next to me. He wanted to see my pain more clearly. "She should be more obedient now, Krilda," he mumbled, his mouth full of popcorn. "She needs to suffer a bit to behave." He just sat there, eating and watching me cry, as if I were a wounded little animal he had picked up on the street. That very night, something inside me died completely. Not just the hope of being saved, but something deeper, the ability to love the man who was supposed to protect me. Lying on the floor, watching him eat popcorn and savor my pain, I understood. I had become a doubly orphan. My mother died of illness, and my father died from his own choices. The next few months were filled with pain and humiliation. Krilda's punishments became increasingly varied. She made me wash the same plate 20 times just because she said it wasn't clean enough. She forced me to sweep the yard in the pouring rain. She woke me up before dawn to clean things that weren't even dirty. And Dad, surprisingly, bought a new, more comfortable chair so he could watch the show more comfortably. He also started buying all sorts of flavored popcorn, sweet, salty, creamy, as if he were in a movie theater, trying out different snacks. One May afternoon, I was sweeping the yard when I heard them talking in the kitchen. Krilda was telling her father how she had made me cry that morning, and he was laughing so hard he was doubled over, as if she had told the funniest joke in the world. "You're so naughty, Krilda. How did you come up with these ideas?" he said between laughs. "This girl must be possessed by the devil." They both laughed together, finding joy and satisfaction in my misfortune. At that moment, leaning against the back wall with the broom still in my hand, I made a decision that would change everything. I could no longer be a victim in the story, no longer a tool for their entertainment. Since they enjoyed watching so much, since the audience was so important to them, one day I would put on a show for them that they would never forget. I began to observe everything with new eyes, their daily routines, habits, quirks. Dad always ate popcorn from the same bowl, always at the same time. Krilda always seasoned her food in the same way. They were all people who did things by habit, predictable, and that was exactly what I could use. So, not yet 13, I began planning a scheme that would take over a year to execute. Because in that house, I learned the most important lesson: patience. They taught me to wait, to endure, to bear pain. Now, I would use that patience against them. Every night after the beatings, I would lie in bed and start thinking. I would imagine the day our roles were reversed. They would be begging on the floor, while I sat in a chair, watching them with the same indifference they had shown me. That damned popcorn sound still echoed in the house every night. Crunch, crunch. But now, that sound no longer filled me with despair. Instead, it was like a countdown clock. June 1966 arrived, and a palpable tension hung in the air, like an impending storm. I was 13, my body beginning to develop and grow taller, which only gave Krilda more reason to torment me. "Look at you. You're getting uglier and uglier," she said, pinching my arm hard. "Who would want an ugly girl like you? You're not even fit to work on the farm." Those days were a terrifying cycle, one after another. I could guess what was going to happen with my eyes closed. Getting up before sunrise, making coffee for them, listening to her say all sorts of mean things about my appearance, working like a slave all day, and watching my father prepare his props. After dinner in the evening, that damn chair, that damn popcorn bowl, and the expectant smile on his face when Krilda started making up reasons to punish me. But on one particular night, June 15th, 1966, something happened that changed everything forever. To this day, whenever I close my eyes, every smell, every sound, and the desperate pounding of my heart from that day are still vivid in my mind. That afternoon, I went to the henhouse to collect the eggs as usual. I counted them carefully. There were 6 in total. I took all 6 eggs to Krilda, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen. She took the eggs, counted them in front of me to confirm there were 6, and then told me to sweep the yard. But that evening, during their happy time, she appeared in the living room with only 4 eggs. "Where are the other 2 eggs, you thief?" she yelled at my father, holding up the 4 eggs in her hand. "You ate them secretly, didn't you? You greedy little devil, you shameless girl." "Mrs. Clitta, I really did take 6 eggs," I tried to explain, the tension in my stomach before the beating rising again. "You counted them in front of me. Are you accusing me of lying, you shameless bastard?" she yelled, throwing the egg hard onto the floor, yolk and white spilling everywhere. "Look what you've made me do. Waste all the food in the house." Dad sat in his usual spot, in his comfortable chair, with a bowl of sweet popcorn he'd specially bought from the market that morning. But this time, I noticed something was different about him. He seemed restless and fidgety, as if waiting for some special performance. He kept shaking his leg, tapping his fingers on the rim of the bowl, and the smile on his face sent chills down my spine. "Krilda," he began, speaking for the first time in 2 years during these discipline classes, "I think this girl needs a lesson she'll never forget today. A real lesson." The tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine. There was a cruelty in his voice I'd never heard before. This was no longer just entertainment. It was something darker, more dangerous. Krilda returned his smile. I saw them exchange a glance, a tacit understanding, as if they had planned it all along, and the egg was just an excuse. "You're right, darling," she said to him in a tender tone she only used when plotting against me. "Thieves should be marked so they'll never dare to steal again." The moment she uttered the word mark, an unprecedented fear crept up my spine. She left the room and went to the kitchen. I heard the sound of a drawer being pulled open, the drawer where the knife was kept. When she returned, she was holding a meat cleaver, a large, heavy knife that gleamed like a cold moonlight in the dim light. That night, she threatened to use violence that would destroy my body. I trembled with fear, backing away step by step until my back hit the rough wall. For the past 2 years, I've only faced pain, but this time, it was a real risk of disfigurement, leaving scars for life. Mrs. Clitta, please, I whispered, my voice weak and desperate. I didn't steal the eggs. I swear to my mother in heaven. Don't you dare swear to your shameless mother, she yelled, her voice loud enough to wake the neighbors. Her face was flushed with anger, and the veins in her neck bulged. Your mother was a lazy woman, just like you. That's why God took her away, getting rid of this useless person. Her slander of my mother shattered something deep inside me. It wasn't sadness, but a pure and intense anger, so intense that I even forgot my fear. The air in the room seemed to thicken and become heavy. You're not allowed to talk about my mother, I finally managed to say, my voice surprisingly firm even to myself. You have no right to talk about her. Krilda stopped screaming, clearly surprised by my defiance. For 2 years, I had never resisted, never dared to respond to her like that. I always kept my head down, silently enduring everything. I looked at my father, a deep wave of nausea washing over me. He wasn't frightened by the knife, nor did he seem worried about me. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, his eyes gleaming with pure excitement. The bowl of popcorn in his hand trembled. It was clear how eager he was. That's right, Krilda, he said in a nauseatingly excited tone. Give this arrogant brat a good lesson, mark her, and make sure she remembers it once and for all. At that moment, watching my father encourage this insane behavior, I understood a devastating truth. He wasn't just a cowardly man who allowed abuse to happen. He was a sadist who took pleasure in my suffering. They were accomplices. He married Krilda not out of love, but because he found someone in her to share his cruel desires. Extend your right hand, Krilda commanded, walking toward me with the knife in hand. I'm going to leave you a deep, beautiful mark, one you'll never forget. The blade reflected the lantern light, casting an evil shadow on the wall. I could see in their expressions a longing to see my blood spilled on the floor. Stretch out your hand, you pathetic wretch, she shouted again, getting even closer to me. No, I said, my voice low but firm, surprising even myself. Krilda stopped in her tracks, her face filled with disbelief. What did you say? I said no, I repeated, this time louder and clearer. I won't reach out my hand. I didn't steal any eggs, and you can't cut me. A deathly silence fell over the room. Even the sound of chewing popcorn stopped. Dad was so surprised he forgot to chew his own popcorn. For 2 years, I had been a rag doll they could manipulate at will, and now, this rag doll dared to talk back. Krilda's face turned purple with rage. Oh, really? She shouted. You dare to order me around now? You dare to be the boss in this house now? She raised her arms high, knife in hand. Then I'll have to teach you a lesson. I'll chop you into pieces. The moment she charged at me, a primal survival instinct erupted within me. 2 years of fear, submission, and silent endurance transformed into a force of resistance. When I saw the knife come down on me, my body reacted before my brain. I dodged to the side, then with all my might, I shoved Krilda's chest with both hands. She staggered backward, lost her balance, and fell heavily to the ground. Her head struck the corner of the wooden table with a loud, terrifying thud that echoed throughout the room. The knife flew through the air, slid a short distance on the floor, and finally came to rest under my father's chair. Krilda lay on the ground, dazed and disoriented. Blood quickly welled up on her forehead as she groaned softly, trying to regain consciousness. That moment felt like an eternity. I stood there, staring at her. For the first time in 2 years, she lay on the ground, vulnerable, wounded, groaning in pain. The feeling was strange. It wasn't satisfaction, but more like an awakening that even monsters bleed. I looked at my dad, expecting him to rush to his injured wife. But what I saw shocked me even more than anything that had happened before. He was still sitting in his chair, watching everything with fascination, not stopping for a second. In fact, he was chewing even more enthusiastically, as if watching an unexpected twist in a play. Get up, Krilda, he said, his voice calm and almost bored, showing no intention of helping. Stop pretending. The girl just gave you a little push. These words struck me like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't worried about her, nor about me. To him, it was all still just entertainment. If I had killed Krilda then, he probably would still be eating popcorn and watching with relish. At that moment, my last shred of unrealistic fantasy shattered completely. I realized that my father wasn't just an accomplice. He was the real monster. Krilda, though cruel, at least had emotions, anger, hatred, and sadistic pleasure. But my father felt nothing. To him, I was less than an animal, merely a tool for his amusement. Krilda shifted on the floor, trying to get up. She touched her forehead and shuddered when she saw the blood on her fingers. The wound wasn't actually serious, but the blood was enough to frighten her. "You bitch," she groaned, still a little dizzy. "You're finished. Just you wait. I won't let you get away with this." But in those few seconds, watching her lying on the ground, vulnerable and bleeding, a fundamental change occurred within me. I understood a simple yet revolutionary truth. They are not gods, but ordinary people, with flesh and blood, capable of injury, pain, and death. "You can't do anything to me anymore," I said, my voice carrying a coldness that surprised even myself. "Because if you touch me again, I'll tell everyone in town everything that's happened in this house." Krilda finally managed to sit up, still rubbing her injured forehead. She smiled, but the smile was tense and uncertain. "Who would believe a liar like you? A thief like you?" "Everyone will believe it," I replied, my voice filled with unwavering conviction. "Mrs. Kitalia has asked me 3 times why I always have injuries on my body. The teachers at school have noticed that I've lost a full 10 pounds. Our neighbor, Adenelda, has told her mother that she hears screams coming from this house every night. Everyone is already suspicious. They're just waiting for confirmation." This was the first time in 2 years that I saw genuine fear in Krilda's eyes, a fear that went to the bone, because she knew I was telling the truth. In a small town like Sweetwater, everyone knows everyone else, and secrets can't be kept forever. I looked at my father and saw that he had completely stopped eating popcorn. The bowl was still on his lap, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was no longer the thrill of sadism, but a cold calculation. He was weighing the consequences, worrying about his reputation, what the neighbors would say, and what his tobacco-growing friends would think of him. "You don't have the courage," Krilda said, but her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "You simply don't have the guts." "I do," I replied, feeling a strange power slowly growing within me. "Do you know why? Because you two have taken everything I could lose. You killed my past self, killed my childhood, killed my confidence, and killed my love for you. Now, you must confront the monster you created." The ensuing silence was heavy, like a tombstone. Krilda slowly stood up, still rubbing the wound on her forehead. Her father continued to look at her with that calculating gaze. For the first time in 2 years, they were afraid of her. "There's one more thing," I continued, feeling the power in my words. "If anything happens to me, if I suddenly get injured, fall ill, or die under mysterious circumstances, I've hidden a letter that explains everything. A letter sent directly to the sheriff." It was a lie. I didn't write any letter at all. But they didn't know. The fear in their eyes showed the lie had worked. That night, after 2 years of hell, I went to sleep without being beaten for the first time. Krilda and her father stayed in the living room, whispering and plotting, trying to figure out how to deal with the reborn me that night. Lying in bed, my heart was still pounding with adrenaline. I knew I had crossed a line of no return. I was no longer the timid little girl I once was. 2 years of torment had forged a completely different person, a more resilient, more ruthless, and more dangerous one. But I didn't feel relief or victory. Rather, I felt a sense of readiness, like a wounded animal finally discovering it had claws and knew how to use them. I had tasted power, I had tasted revenge, and I wanted more. From that night on, I began to observe everything with a completely different perspective. No longer was I a victim studying her abuser, but a predator analyzing her prey. Every habit, every routine, every weakness became invaluable intelligence. Dad always ate popcorn from the same bowl, always at the same time, always with the same flavors. Krilda always tasted her food before it was served, always seasoned it in the same way. They were predictable, acting according to habit, and that was precisely what I could exploit. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at home completely changed. They were extremely cautious with me, carefully considering their words, afraid of offending me. But I knew this was only temporary. People like them wouldn't truly change. They were just waiting for an opportunity to go back to how things were before. With this in mind, I began to formulate a plan that required time to develop, patience, and precise execution. They taught me to wait, to be patient, and to plan quietly. Now, I want to return those lessons to them exactly as they were taught. Their wedding anniversary is approaching June 20th. 2 years of marriage have been 2 years of hell for me, but for them, it's been 2 years of torturous pleasure. Perhaps this is the perfect time to give them an unforgettable birthday gift. This gift will use Dad's favorite popcorn bowl, Krilda's habit of always tasting the food first, and the rat and ant poison stored in the backyard shed. On the night of June 15th, that timid and cowardly girl was dead. In her place stood a woman who knew what she wanted and how to get it. And what I wanted most was to watch the two of them pleading on the floor while I sat in my chair, eating popcorn, enjoying this performance that was mine to watch. From my rebellion to their wedding anniversary, those 5 days were the most tense of my life. Every morning I woke up with an unusually clear mind, a feeling I'd never experienced before. Krilda and my father walked around me as if I were on a landmine. When they thought I wasn't paying attention, they would whisper to each other. They would also hold secret meetings in the backyard, glancing at me every now and then, trying to figure out if I really had the courage to carry out my threats. The wound on her forehead was slowly healing, but it would leave a small scar, a daily reminder of the power I possessed. During those days, I developed the patience of a fisherman. I observed their every move, every habit, every ritual, like a scientist studying a rare specimen. The more carefully I observed, the clearer and more complete my plan became. Dad maintained his usual routine, waking up before sunrise, drinking black coffee with brown sugar, then working in the tobacco fields until sunset. But evenings were sacred and inviolable for him. He would sit in his special chair, his popcorn bowl ready, enjoying his familiar entertainment. Only now, unable to openly torment me, he became restless and frustrated, like an addict going through withdrawal. Krilda, on the other hand, had complete control of the kitchen. She was in charge of seasoning all the food, tasting each dish before it was served, and deciding what and when everyone would eat. Her habit of tasting the food first had almost become an obsession. It was through observing this habit that a perfect plan took shape in my mind. A plan to use their own habits against them, a plan to turn revenge into a work of art. The date couldn't be more symbolic. June 20th, 1966, the second anniversary of the wedding that had dragged my life into hell. Krilda was preparing a special dinner for the occasion. She'd bought a large rooster at the market, taken out the finest spices, and had been talking for days about how it would be an unforgettable celebration. "This will be a very special night," she said as she prepared the ingredients on the 18th. 2 years of marriage deserve a celebration worthy of it. She had no idea just how special that night would be. On the morning of the 19th, after Dad went to work, I began to put my plan into action. First, I went to the shed in the backyard, where tools and insecticide were kept. Behind a tall shelf, I found what I needed, a small jar of rat poison. The salesman had promised that, if the dosage was sufficient, it could even kill an elephant. That morning, I hid what I needed and then began, enthusiastically, preparing a special dinner for Krilda. Krilda had already portioned out all the ingredients, and on the counter sat Dad's special tin can for popcorn, the one he treasured and only used on special occasions. I spent the whole day helping, feigning a kind of obedience I no longer possessed. During the preparations, while she was out getting spices, I made the decision that I would never return. As night fell, they enjoyed a pleasant dinner and discussed their future plans. Then Dad went to prepare his special popcorn. I offered to help, saying in a gentle tone I hadn't dared to use in years, "Let me help you make the popcorn. Today is a special day." He happily agreed. We busied ourselves side by side, preparing what would be his last bowl of popcorn. While he wasn't looking, I finished my plan. They sat down in the living room to celebrate. For the next 20 minutes, they chatted and ate, while I sat quietly in a chair in the corner, watching. Then, Dad started to sense something was wrong. "This chicken seems a bit strange," he muttered. Soon, Krilda also began to feel unwell. The pain came swiftly and violently. They screamed, cried, and pleaded for my help. And me? I remained seated, watching, bearing the same indifference they had shown me before. I calmly stood up, picked up the few clean kernels of popcorn that had fallen to the ground, and sat down in my father's special chair, the chair he had used for the past 2 years to watch me suffer. "Please help us," they pleaded. That's interesting, I replied calmly, munching on popcorn. I remember begging you like this countless times before, but you never stopped. That night, the roles were completely reversed. I became the audience. The two of them writhed on the floor, pleading for help, begging for forgiveness, promising that everything would change if I saved them. But their voices grew weaker and weaker, more and more desperate. Do you know? I picked up another piece of popcorn and chewed slowly. For the past 2 years, you have been my audience. You have seen every tear I shed, every scream I let out, and every painful moment I went through in this house. Do you know what hurts me the most? It's not the physical pain, but seeing how much you enjoy it. The father tried to say something, but only blood flowed from his mouth. Krilda also barely moved, and her breathing became increasingly irregular. Today, I continued, finishing the last piece of popcorn. I'm the audience. Today, I'm sitting here eating popcorn and watching you struggle. You know what? I feel nothing. No joy, no sympathy, no sorrow. Nothing at all. You've already killed any feelings I might have for you. Their movements grew weaker and weaker, their screams turning into low moans. Life was slowly and painfully draining from their bodies, just as they had done to me, only in a different way. The difference between me and you, I said, is that you are torturing an innocent person, while I am simply giving you the punishment you deserve. Krilda stopped breathing first, her eyes still open, staring straight at the ceiling. Her father held on for a few more minutes, trying to say something, but ultimately couldn't utter a word. When the room finally fell completely silent, I stood up from my chair and took one last look at the two corpses on the floor. I felt neither victory nor relief. I felt only emptiness, as if a long and painful chapter in my life had finally come to an end. I picked up a small suitcase I'd prepared beforehand, containing a few clothes and some money I'd secretly saved. Without looking back, I left the house, walking down the dark streets of Sweetwater, heading out of town. I never went back, and I never even considered knowing what happened next, how they found the body, what people would say. That part of me had died with them in that room. From that moment on, a new woman was born. I understood that sometimes justice doesn't come from heaven or from the courts, but from the hands of those who have nothing left and have no fear. Now, I'm 72 years old and living in this little house in Sweetwater. Yes, I've returned to where it all began. After years of living elsewhere, working as a maid, a seamstress, and a cook, in 1995, when I was 42, I decided to come back here to reconcile with my past. Life taught me that running away never solves anything. One day, you have to come back and confront the ghosts that haunt you. When I returned, the house I lived in as a child was gone. It had been demolished, and 2 small houses had been built in its place. It was as if that place, filled with pain, had completely vanished from the face of the earth. My days are filled with wonderful things. I get up early to water my herb garden, and for breakfast I have tapioca flour with koalo cheese. In the mornings, I listen to the radio while embroidering towels. In the afternoons, my grandchildren come to visit. I have 4 grandchildren, all children of my only daughter, who lives just 2 blocks away. When I was 28, I married a good man named Valder. But he passed away from heart disease 10 years ago. He was a kind-hearted bricklayer with calloused hands, but a very soft heart. He never raised his voice at me, nor did he ever hurt me with his words. Being with him, I realized that not all men are monsters, and that true love really exists in this world. My daughter's name is Franciscoca, and I gave birth to her when I was 30. I raised her with more love and patience than I ever received. Now, she is a teacher and has a happy family. She never knew the full story of my past. Some things are better left to the grave. Every Saturday, I go to the market to sell my embroidery and sometimes roasted coconut candy to earn some pocket money. Every Thursday, I go to the health center to participate in senior citizen group activities. We exercise together, talk about recipes, family therapies, and our mischievous grandchildren. When I look back, I feel no anger, no hatred. Those 2 got what they deserved, and I got the life I deserved. It's that simple. Justice may be delayed sometimes, but it will always arrive in some way. My little house has 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen, and a small yard. I grow some herbs in the yard and raise a few chickens. This is all I need: peace, tranquility, and a clear conscience after doing what needs to be done. Dear friends, If you are experiencing something similar to what I've been going through, if you are being abused, humiliated, or hurt by those who are supposed to protect you, I want to say one thing to you. You are not alone. Even though it may seem hopeless, there is always a way out. I am not advocating violence here. Absolutely not. What I did that June night was a desperate act by a girl who saw no other way out. Now, thank God, there are places to report abuse, professionals to help, and laws to protect children. In your country, seek help from the authorities, find protective organizations, and talk to teachers, trusted neighbors, or relatives who can intervene. But I want you to understand one thing. I survived because I learned that we are much stronger than we think. I learned that when we think we've hit rock bottom, we still have the strength to dig a little deeper and find a way out we've never seen before. To those who have never experienced this, but know those who are, please don't close your eyes. Don't pretend this doesn't concern you. Reach out and offer help. Be the kind of person I hoped would be in my life back then. You might be the difference between someone who wants to give up and someone who finds the strength to keep going. Dear friends, before I say goodbye, I want to make a special request to those who have listened to my story until the very end. If this story has touched you in any way, and if you believe there are others who need to hear it, please press the subscribe button immediately and turn on the notification bell. Not tomorrow, not later, but now. Because do you know why? Because stories like mine need to be told. They need to be shared with those who suffer in silence, those who think there is no way out, and those who have lost hope after the fiercest storms. When you subscribe and share, you're helping these words reach those who need them most. Please do me a favor, write one word in the comments, strength. Those who have read this far, understand my story, and want to be part of this chain of support, and hope simply need to write that word, strength.